Hey dudes, tonight we're diving into the sun-baked, olive oil-slicked world of ancient Greece, a place known for its philosophy, democracy, and statues that didn't bother with pants. But behind the stories of Plato, Sparta, and the Golden Temples, there's a much tougher truth. While ancient Greece gave us the foundation of Western civilization, it also made life a daily battle for the average person, something that would be almost impossible to survive today. Before we jump in, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where everyone's joining from. Now dim the lights, and if you've got a partner, give them a hug. If not, don't worry, I'm single too. Let's just chill and dive into tonight's journey. The first thing to understand about ancient Greece is that it wasn't just a land of philosophers and warriors, as history books often tell us. It was a place of rigid social structures and tough, sometimes grueling daily life. While we often romanticize ancient civilizations, life in Greece was not about grand debates in Athens or elegant plays in the theaters. It was, for the most part, an unrelenting grind. For the common person, whether free or enslaved, surviving in ancient Greece meant adhering to a series of roles dictated by one's gender, class, and city-state. The majority of Greeks did not get the privilege of living out the intellectual ideals of the great philosophers they are now famous for. Instead, they had to work hard. You might imagine ancient Greece as a land of leisure, filled with dramatic dialogues in marble halls, but it was also a land where survival was a constant challenge. Families struggled with basic necessities such as food, shelter, and clothing, which were not easily come by, and where most people had little control over their daily life. Consider the food you eat on a daily basis. It might come from a supermarket or a local farm, and you can make decisions about what you eat based on taste and preference. In ancient Greece, however, food was often scarce and dependent on the seasons, which dictated the crop cycles. The average Athenian diet consisted mostly of bread, olives, and wine, foods that would not be considered luxurious today. And while we often hear about the intellectual and artistic achievements of the Greeks, the reality for most was far less glamorous. There were no running water systems, and people had to rely on public wells for water, a luxury that we take for granted today. The streets were often filthy, and disease spread easily in these crowded conditions. But perhaps the most striking aspect of ancient Greek life, which makes it a hard existence to imagine, was the absence of modern conveniences. There were no sophisticated medical tools or practices to deal with illness or injury. If you broke a leg, you were in serious trouble. Without modern painkillers or antibiotics, surviving even the simplest injuries was a matter of luck. The government, too, wasn't focused on ensuring the comfort of its citizens. Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta operated on strict codes that placed limits on individual freedoms. The society's elite, particularly in Athens, enjoyed the luxuries of philosophy, art, and debate, but the vast majority lived in conditions that would seem utterly unbearable by modern standards. Most Greeks worked long hours in fields or in the marketplace. Slavery was common, and while it is often romanticized in modern media, being a slave in ancient Greece was a brutal experience, with no rights or recourse for abuses. As a free man, your choices were limited. Your social standing determined what kind of life you could have. Most were bound to a hard, laborious existence that revolved around the demands of agriculture and military service. The rest of your life was spent paying taxes to the state, worshiping the gods, and attending public festivals that did little to alleviate the demands of daily survival. The stark reality of daily life in ancient Greece raises a key question. Could you survive in such a harsh environment without the comforts and technologies we rely on today? Social and political realities of ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, surviving wasn't just about the physical hardships of daily life, but also about navigating a complex social and political system that often demanded conformity and submission. The structure of Greek society was rigid, and any deviation from the norm could have serious consequences. If you thought the daily struggle for food and water was challenging, try imagining the added pressure of having to fit within a strict set of rules regarding your role in society. At the top of the social pyramid were the elite, those who owned land or had connections to the wealthy aristocracy. These were the men who could afford leisure time, who could spend their days discussing philosophy or politics. But for the vast majority of Greeks, life was centered around the city-state's needs. These city-states, whether Athens, Sparta, Corinth, or Thebes, operated under their own distinct sets of laws, each with its own expectations of citizens. In Athens, citizenship was a highly coveted status. To be a citizen was to be free, but freedom in Athens came at the price of participation in public life. The Athenians prided themselves on democracy, yet their version of democracy was far from inclusive. Only adult male citizens, who were freeborn and had completed military training, were allowed to participate in political matters. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from political life entirely. In fact, the majority of the population had no say in how the city-state was governed, despite the fact that their lives depended on it. In Sparta, life was even more rigid. Here, the city-state was governed by military discipline. The Spartan system placed a premium on physical strength, obedience, and service to the state above all else. As a child, if you were born a boy, you were sent to military training at the age of 7. There you were taught to endure hardship, to fight, and to prioritize the needs of Sparta over everything, even your own life. For the Spartan women, the roles were slightly different. They were tasked with managing the household and producing strong children who could become soldiers, but they enjoyed more freedoms than women in other Greek city-states. But what about those who didn't belong to the elite, those who didn't have the privilege of citizenship or military training? For them, life was often a struggle for survival, marked by long hours of labor and a constant need to remain in good standing with the authorities. Slavery was an integral part of Greek society, and slaves were considered property rather than people. Many slaves in Athens were foreigners captured in war or sold into servitude, while in Sparta, slaves, known as helots, were primarily the conquered people of Messenia. Helots outnumbered their Spartan masters by a large margin, and their rebellion was a constant threat to Spartan society. In Athens, the plight of the poor was often ignored by the ruling class, despite the fact that they made up a significant portion of the population. While the elite could debate philosophy and politics in the agora, the poor were left to toil in the fields or to man the ships that sailed out of Athens' busy harbor. The Athenians valued civic duty, but this duty did not extend to everyone. The poorest members of society had little control over their lives, and were often subject to harsh penalties if they failed to meet the expectations of the state. And let's not forget the military demands. In a world where war was a constant threat, every able-bodied man was required to serve in the military. Military service wasn't a choice, it was an obligation. For many, this meant months of grueling training, followed by lengthy campaigns away from home. Even when not at war, a soldier's life was never easy. The lack of modern comforts made every battle exhausting, and the constant threat of death loomed large. As for women, their lives were equally constrained. While Spartan women had more freedoms, Athenian women were largely confined to the home. Their primary responsibility was to bear children and manage the household, and they had little say in the political or social affairs of the city. Women were regarded as the property of their fathers or husbands, with limited rights and freedoms. So, what did a day in the life of an average Athenian woman look like? It was spent managing the household, preparing meals, and raising children, all while remaining out of the public eye. Athenian women were rarely seen in public unless they were attending religious ceremonies. Women could not vote or own property, and their legal status was secondary to the men in their lives. But why did women in Athens accept such limitations? It wasn't just because it was a matter of tradition, but because the very foundation of their society was built on exclusion. The Greeks believed in the superiority of free male citizens, and this belief was ingrained in every aspect of their culture. Women were seen as too weak to partake in politics or the intellectual life that flourished in Athens. The more you look into the daily lives of the Greeks, the more you see how difficult it was to survive in such a structured society, where freedom was limited, survival was difficult, and every person had a designated role. Would you be able to handle such a constrained existence? Could you survive in a world where survival often depended on fulfilling your assigned role, and where rebellion was not only frowned upon but could be fatal? The enduring legacy and reflection on ancient Greek life. As we come to the final chapter of ancient Greek life, it is important to reflect on the resilience that defined the people who lived during this era. Despite the harsh realities and struggles that seem to overshadow everyday existence, the Greek civilization produced some of the most profound contributions to modern society. But how did these legacies come to be in such an unforgiving environment? To understand this, we must acknowledge that much of what we know and appreciate about ancient Greece, its art, philosophy, politics, and science, was built upon the backs of individuals who endured hardship daily. While the philosophers and generals are remembered in history, it's easy to forget that their achievements rested on the labor of countless anonymous individuals who lived, suffered, and sometimes died in silence. The contributions of the Greeks are undeniable, from the foundations of democracy in Athens to the development of Western philosophy by figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But these intellectual milestones weren't isolated from the more mundane aspects of daily life. The early philosophers didn't just ponder the nature of the universe from ivory towers. They were often engaged in the everyday struggles of survival, health, and social navigation that we've discussed in previous sections. But the reality of how these intellectual ideas flourished is far from glamorous. While the wealthy could afford leisure and education, for the majority, these ideals were inaccessible. The average person was too busy to engage in philosophical debates, too preoccupied with the demands of family and survival. The irony lies in the fact that the civilization most famous for fostering high culture and intellectual thought was also a society that demanded rigid roles from its citizens, with limited room for deviation. Even the greatest philosophers and thinkers were often detached from the everyday lives of those they wrote about. They observed the poor, the workers, and the women, but rarely did they fully engage with the difficulties these groups faced on a daily basis. Take, for instance, the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope. He lived in a barrel, rejecting all material possessions and embracing an ascetic life. While his teachings were revolutionary in many ways, his life was an exception. Most Greeks could not afford such luxuries, as living without the burden of social roles and obligations. What is clear, however, is that life in ancient Greece was a constant negotiation between the individual and society. The role that each person played was essential to the functioning of the city-state, yet personal fulfillment was often sidelined in favor of maintaining order. This societal structure, which favored civic duty above personal well-being, is part of what has made ancient Greece both a land of monumental achievements and a place of constant human struggle. So, did the hardships of daily life overshadow the contributions made by Greek civilization? In many ways, it did. But it's this very paradox, where individuals were required to endure immense hardships in order to maintain a system that produced remarkable achievements, that continues to captivate us today. When we study the lives of the average Greeks, we don't just see a civilization of great thinkers and warriors, but a people who, despite limited resources and social mobility, found ways to leave their mark on history. Their story, a blend of harsh realities and intellectual glory, tells us something profound about the human spirit. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, people find ways to create, endure, and ultimately shape the future. As we look back on ancient Greece, we are reminded that the challenges of life are universal. While our technology and comforts have changed, the fundamental human experience, struggling for survival, for meaning, for recognition, has remained the same. The Greeks may not have had air conditioning or modern medicine, but they had the same hopes, fears, and desires that we carry with us today. Reflection. Could you, in your modern comfort, survive in ancient Greece? Would you have been able to rise above the strict social structure to achieve something great? Or would you have been one of the countless ordinary people whose names history forgot, who labored daily just to survive? The ancient Greeks left us with a legacy that resonates through our lives today, but it is their everyday struggles, the ones we often overlook, that have the power to inspire us most. And with that, we conclude our deep dive into the daily life of ancient Greece, a place of intellectual wonder and brutal survival. The stories of these people, whose struggles have been largely forgotten by time, remind us that history is made not just by the great and the powerful, but also by those who endured the mundane and the harsh. The ordinary lives of ancient Romans, day-to-day struggles, the hardships of daily life in ancient Rome. Much like their Greek counterparts, the Romans were known for their grand achievements, vast empires, monumental buildings, and groundbreaking innovations in law and politics. But when we peel back the layers of Roman grandeur, we discover a society far more focused on survival than glory. For most of the Roman population, life was about enduring hardship, managing survival, and fulfilling essential roles within the empire. Imagine yourself living in ancient Rome, not as an emperor or soldier, but as a common citizen. You would wake up to the sounds of the bustling city, horses trotting, merchants shouting in the streets, and children playing in the narrow alleyways. Yet beneath the noise and activity, there was a constant undercurrent of struggle. For the majority of Romans, life revolved around labor, hard physical labor. Whether you were working in the fields on construction projects or serving as a tradesperson, work was a relentless part of daily life. The Romans, though skilled in engineering and architecture, did not have the luxury of machinery or modern tools. All the grand structures we admire today, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the Roman Forum, were built through immense human labor, often under grueling conditions. Let's start with something as fundamental as food. The average Roman didn't dine on the luxurious feasts we imagine from historical dramas. Instead, their meals consisted of simple, often bland foods. Bread made from barley or wheat was the staple of the Roman diet, supplemented by olives, cheese, and occasionally fish or meat. For the lower classes, meals were often small and lacked variety, while the wealthier classes might enjoy more lavish spreads. But acquiring food wasn't simple. For those living in Rome's bustling city center, the market was a constant place of activity, but the cost of goods was high. Food shortages were common, and the urban poor often relied on grain handouts from the government, a practice instituted to keep the masses satisfied and prevent unrest. For farmers in the countryside, life was similarly difficult. Crop failures, bad weather, and taxation by the state made it hard for many to maintain a steady food supply. Beyond the kitchen, Roman homes were typically small and cramped. The majority of the population lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were often overcrowded and lacked basic amenities. In these dwellings, the conditions were far from comfortable, rooms were small, and privacy was nearly non-existent. If you lived on the upper floors of an insula, you would face a constant risk of fire due to the flammable materials used in construction. But life wasn't just hard because of physical space or hunger. It was also filled with the anxiety of uncertainty. Ancient Rome had a vast population, around 1 million in the city at its peak, but it was a society where the majority of people had very little control over their fate. The elite class enjoyed the luxury of political power and leisure, but for the vast majority, there was little to no upward mobility. Your life was largely dictated by your birth. Slavery was a significant part of the Roman economy, and slaves were used for everything from household chores to hard labor in the mines. They were often treated as property, not people, and faced brutal working conditions. In some parts of the empire, the labor of slaves was so vital that it's difficult to imagine the empire functioning without it. If you were born into slavery, your fate was sealed, unless you were fortunate enough to be freed by a kind master, which was rare. Roman women, while sometimes able to enjoy more freedom than their counterparts in other ancient civilizations, still faced many restrictions. They were largely excluded from public life, unable to vote or participate in government. Their role was primarily confined to managing the household and raising children, though some women did wield power behind the scenes, especially in noble families. Still, their lives were largely defined by their relationship to men, either their fathers, husbands, or sons. With all these challenges, what motivated the average Roman to keep going? The answer lies in the Roman worldview, one that emphasized endurance, duty, and service to the empire. Romans had a deep sense of civic duty ingrained in them from childhood. The concept of virtus, the idea of courage, honor, and strength, was central to Roman identity, and it was taught from a young age. The average Roman didn't aspire to fame or luxury, but rather to fulfill their duty as part of a greater collective, serving the empire and their families. And while the physical struggles of daily life were tough, the psychological burden of maintaining one's place in society was even more challenging. Every Roman, whether rich or poor, had to constantly prove their worth, whether in battle, in business, or in politics. And failure to meet those expectations could mean losing everything: your property, your freedom, or even your life. The unseen struggles of Roman soldiers and slaves. Now, let us turn our attention to two groups within Roman society whose lives were even more grueling than the average citizen: the Roman soldiers and slaves. Both groups, despite their crucial roles in the empire's expansion and maintenance, lived lives marked by immense hardship, often far removed from the glory of their military victories or the wealth of their masters. Roman soldiers, the harsh realities of warfare and duty. If you were a Roman soldier, your life was dictated by duty to the empire. Military service wasn't voluntary for most. Citizens were expected to serve in the legions, especially in times of war. But even in peacetime, soldiers were expected to maintain discipline and training. The Roman army was one of the most powerful military forces in the ancient world, and it was built upon the backs of men who endured harsh conditions and rigorous discipline. The life of a Roman soldier was one of constant physical hardship. Imagine being stationed in a foreign land, far from your family and home, often facing inclement weather and disease. The Roman army was infamous for its long marches, often covering up to 20 miles a day, carrying heavy gear and weapons. For many soldiers, this was just the beginning of their hardships. While the army offered steady pay and the possibility of land upon retirement, the risks were enormous. Battles were brutal and bloody, and many soldiers didn't survive the wars they were sent to fight. Even those who made it through the fighting still faced the threat of disease, which claimed countless lives in the military camps. Hygiene was poor, and the spread of illnesses like malaria and dysentery was common. A soldier might return home only to be struck down by illness, having survived the front lines but unable to escape the unseen dangers of army life. Despite these difficulties, soldiers were expected to maintain strict discipline, and their personal lives were highly regulated. They were forbidden from marrying during their service, which could last for 25 years or more. They were often confined to military camps or stations, far from any form of civilian comfort or relaxation. Socializing with non-soldiers was restricted, and even personal relationships were often deemed a distraction from their military duties. Roman soldiers were not simply warriors, they were also builders and engineers. Much of the infrastructure of the Roman Empire, such as roads, forts, and aqueducts, was constructed by soldiers during peacetime. These projects were physically demanding and often dangerous, as soldiers worked in conditions that would be difficult to tolerate by today's standards. Yet, despite all the struggles, a soldier's role was one of pride. Military service was a key part of Roman identity, and those who served in the legions were seen as the backbone of the empire. But for many soldiers, this pride didn't erase the relentless hardships of daily life. Now imagine a different reality, being born into slavery. Slaves in Rome were a vital part of the economy, and their labor was used for everything from manual labor to household duties. But despite the essential nature of their work, they were considered property, not people, and their lives were marked by cruelty, hardship, and a lack of any legal recourse. Most slaves in ancient Rome were prisoners of war, brought back from the empire's conquests, though some were born into slavery. They worked in a variety of roles, from domestic servants in wealthy households to laborers in the fields, mines, and on construction sites. The work was grueling, and the conditions were often harsh. Slaves had no legal rights, and their masters had complete control over their lives. Punishment for disobedience could be severe: whippings, branding, or even execution. For those who worked in the homes of wealthy Romans, life was slightly better. They might have better food and more comfortable living conditions than those working in the fields or mines, but they were still subjugated. Many slaves in these households would perform a wide range of tasks, including cooking, cleaning, and even managing their master's business affairs. However, even the relatively comfortable life of a domestic slave came with constant fear. Slaves were never allowed to leave their masters' homes, and even the smallest mistake could result in a brutal punishment. What's more, slaves in ancient Rome had no opportunity for advancement. Unlike Roman citizens, who could aspire to higher social and political status, slaves had no hope of ever achieving freedom unless granted by their master. This was rare, though some slaves could buy their freedom or be freed by their masters as a reward for loyalty or good service. But these instances were the exception rather than the rule. The Roman Empire depended on slavery to maintain its economic and military dominance, yet slaves lived lives of constant uncertainty and fear. They had no rights, no opportunities to improve their circumstances, and no say in their own futures. It's a grim reality, but it was the reality for the vast majority of people in the empire. As we reflect on the lives of Roman soldiers and slaves, we are reminded that even in a society renowned for its military and political successes, the majority of people lived in circumstances defined by hardship, violence, and limited personal freedom. The struggles of these individuals were crucial to the functioning of the empire, yet they were often forgotten by history. The grand achievements of Rome, the vast empire, the monumental architecture, and the political innovations were built upon their backs, even though they were rarely, if ever, acknowledged. How would you have fared in ancient Rome? Would you have had the strength to endure the endless work, the fear of punishment, and the uncertainty of your fate? Would you have been one of the lucky few who managed to thrive? Or would you have struggled alongside the countless others whose stories have been lost to time? The legacy of Roman struggles and reflections on modern parallels. As we bring the story of ancient Rome to a close, we must pause and reflect on how the struggles of everyday Romans, soldiers, slaves, and citizens alike, shaped not just the empire but the course of history. While we admire the legacies of Roman governance, architecture, and warfare, the truth of Roman life for the majority was one of sacrifice, hardship, and survival. In many ways, the lives of the ordinary Romans are the most poignant part of Roman history. For every general who led victorious battles, for every emperor who ruled over vast territories, there were countless individuals who worked the fields, built the roads, fought in wars, and endured the oppressive weight of a social hierarchy that kept them in their place. And yet, these same people contributed to the greatness of Rome, sometimes without recognition, but always with the effort that ensured the empire's endurance. Consider the Roman soldiers once more. These men were the backbone of the empire, and yet their lives were full of hardship. Beyond the brutal training, the long marches, and the constant threat of death, soldiers were often deprived of personal lives, confined to military discipline and the demands of the state. Yet the empire depended on them. Every victory, every campaign was a testament to their sacrifice. After serving in battle, many soldiers returned to civilian life to settle on newly conquered lands. But the scars of war often lingered long after the fighting ended. The legacy of the Roman soldier is intertwined with that of the empire itself, an empire that spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, leaving a mark that still resonates today. Roads built by soldiers, cities established by generals, and laws enacted by the ruling class shaped much of the Western world's development. The military prowess of Rome created an empire that lasted for centuries. But it was the ordinary soldier, the man far from the glory of battlefields, who endured the true cost of empire. And then there are the slaves, those whose labor was integral to the Roman economy, yet were treated as nothing more than property. They were the silent workers who built the empire, from the grand amphitheaters to the monumental baths and temples. Though we remember the gladiators in the arena, we forget that many of them were slaves, forced to fight for the entertainment of the masses. Their lives were marked by cruelty and deprivation, and many never had the chance to live freely. Yet despite this, the legacy of Roman slavery also echoes through history. The question of slavery and freedom remains a defining issue in societies long after Rome's fall. The struggle for freedom, equality, and human dignity that began in ancient societies is still felt today. In many ways, the Roman Empire's reliance on slavery mirrors the struggles for justice that continue in modern times, reminding us of the importance of reflecting on the past to understand the present. In the end, we must remember that while the empire itself is remembered for its glory, it was the countless individuals, the soldiers who served, the slaves who labored, the citizens who lived and died in the shadow of imperial ambition, who made that glory possible. These were the people whose stories were never told, but whose struggles were vital to the empire's rise and fall. Their lives, marked by hardship, are a testament to human resilience and the ability to endure in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Reflection. How often do we consider the struggles of those who live in the shadows of greatness? In modern times, we celebrate the achievements of nations, corporations, and individuals, but how many of us truly acknowledge the silent contributions of the everyday person? Much like the Romans, we too rely on the labor of the unseen to build our societies, whether through the sacrifices of workers, soldiers, or marginalized communities. The question remains, can we honor their legacy as we move forward, just as the Romans in their grandeur left behind their own silent heroes? The legacy of Rome, in its struggles and triumphs, serves as a reminder that history is not just about what is remembered in grand monuments, but about the lives lived beneath the surface, lives that shaped the course of the world. The hidden history of the Great Pyramids, who really built them. The mystery of the builders. The Great Pyramids of Giza are perhaps the most iconic structures in the world. Standing tall and imposing against the Egyptian skyline, they have captured the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and tourists for centuries. Yet, despite their fame and grandeur, there is a mystery that has puzzled scholars for thousands of years. Who truly built these monumental structures? Today, we know that the pyramids were constructed during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, around 2580 to 2560 BCE, but the question of who built them and how remains elusive. For many, the answer seems obvious. The pyramids were built by the pharaoh's slaves, but this is not necessarily the case. Recent discoveries have begun to challenge this traditional view, suggesting that the builders were, in fact, skilled laborers who were not slaves at all, but highly organized workers, some of whom were likely treated well and even lived in relative comfort. Let's begin with the first pyramid ever constructed, the Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. Built by Pharaoh Djoser in the 27th century BCE, this pyramid is considered the predecessor to the Great Pyramids. Though not as grand as its later successors, Djoser's pyramid marked a major step forward in ancient Egyptian engineering. It was built using limestone, rather than the sandstone typically used in earlier structures. The architect responsible for this early marvel was Imhotep, a brilliant and multifaceted figure who has often been credited as the father of pyramid design. Now, fast forward to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Pharaoh Khufu, also known as Cheops, is traditionally believed to have commissioned the pyramid. According to ancient texts, this pyramid was built with a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands. Popular belief suggests that these workers were slaves, forced into labor for the glory of the pharaoh. However, modern archaeologists are beginning to challenge this narrative, based on new evidence uncovered at the site of the Giza pyramids. In the 1990s, a team of archaeologists discovered the remains of a workers' village near the pyramids. The village contained evidence of skilled laborers who lived in relatively good conditions and worked in rotation to build the pyramids. The workers' tombs were also found near the village, suggesting that they were treated with respect after their deaths and possibly even honored for their contribution to the empire. This discovery points to the possibility that the workers were not slaves, but paid laborers who received wages and possibly even food and shelter for their work. The workers likely consisted of a combination of skilled masons, laborers, engineers, and architects, all of whom were essential to the success of the pyramid construction. These workers were organized into teams that were responsible for specific tasks. Some teams may have worked on quarrying and transporting the massive stones used to construct the pyramids, while others may have focused on the intricate details of the pyramid's design. Furthermore, it is now believed that the building process itself was far more sophisticated than once thought. The construction of the Great Pyramid required the development of complex logistics, including the transportation of massive stones from distant quarries. The stones were likely moved using sleds, ropes, and rollers, but there is still much debate on the precise methods used. Some scholars believe that a system of ramps, either straight, zigzagging, or spiral, was used to move the stones into place. While the exact construction method is still uncertain, the sophistication of the process demonstrates that these workers were highly skilled and well organized. But how did these workers manage to construct such an enormous and precise structure with the technology available at the time? The answer lies not just in their skill, but also in the ingenuity of their methods. The Egyptians were masters of engineering, and their understanding of mathematics and geometry was advanced for their time. The pyramid's alignment with the cardinal points and its near-perfect proportions are evidence of the precision and planning that went into its design. Though we know much about the how of pyramid construction, the who remains a subject of ongoing debate. Were the workers slaves or paid laborers? Were they voluntary workers, or were they coerced into labor? The answer is likely more nuanced than we have historically believed. What we do know is that these workers played a crucial role in creating one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Egypt: the life of the pyramid builders and the role of the pharaohs. As we continue exploring the construction of the Great Pyramids, we must delve into the lives of those who actually built them. While we've established that they were not mere slaves, the daily lives of these workers were still far from comfortable. These men and women were dedicated to the task of creating monuments to the pharaohs, and their work, while skilled and highly respected, came with its own set of challenges and hardships. One of the most important revelations from archaeological discoveries at Giza is the discovery of the workers' village, which provides us with a glimpse into the lives of the men who spent their days constructing the Great Pyramid. The village was surprisingly well organized, with rows of houses, bakeries, and even a cemetery for the workers. These workers were housed in small mud-brick dwellings that were carefully arranged to allow for easy access to the construction site. The presence of bakeries and other food provisions suggests that the workers were well fed and provided for during their time on the project. Interestingly, the workers were not the only ones who lived in this village. Archaeologists found evidence of a well-maintained social structure, with specific roles and responsibilities assigned to each member of the labor force. Some workers were tasked with quarrying the limestone blocks, while others were responsible for shaping and transporting the stones. Others still were involved in the actual assembly of the pyramid itself, using ramps and ropes to move the massive stones into place. Life in this workers' village was likely not luxurious, but it appears that the workers were respected for their efforts. They were provided with food, shelter, and a steady income. This is a stark contrast to the traditional image of slaves being forced to work under harsh conditions with no compensation. The discovery of workers' tombs near the village is another telling sign. These tombs were modest but dignified, suggesting that these workers were given respect in death for their contributions to the pyramid's construction. Furthermore, the discovery of worker graffiti on the stones used in the construction of the pyramid provides insight into the workers' sense of pride. Some of the inscriptions contain the names of the workers, while others contain symbols that may have been used to mark the work of specific teams. This suggests that the workers took pride in their work and may have even viewed themselves as contributing to the greatness of the pharaoh, whose eternal life was symbolized by the pyramids they built. However, while the workers may have been respected, their lives were still difficult. Working on the pyramids required great physical strength and endurance, and the construction site was often dangerous. The massive stones weighed several tons, and transporting them over long distances was a monumental task. The work was grueling and could take a physical toll on the workers, who labored under the harsh Egyptian sun. Many workers likely suffered from injuries or illnesses, and while there is evidence that they were treated with care, it is unclear whether they received any form of medical treatment. But beyond the physical demands of the work, there was the ever-present influence of the pharaoh. The pharaoh, viewed as a divine ruler, held absolute power over every aspect of society, including the pyramid construction. His divine mandate was the driving force behind the monumental projects that characterized the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The construction of the pyramid was seen as a way to ensure the pharaoh's immortality, but the workers were also contributing to their own legacy. These monuments would stand as symbols of their efforts for millennia. The pharaohs understood the importance of these projects, not just for their own afterlife, but for the maintenance of their divine authority. Building the pyramids was as much about cementing their power as it was about providing for the gods. The laborers' involvement in the creation of these monumental structures was a demonstration of their loyalty and devotion to the pharaoh. In return, the pharaohs would offer rewards, food, shelter, and honor to those who contributed to these grandiose projects. Despite the hardships and sacrifices involved in pyramid construction, the workers were part of something larger than themselves. They were not just laborers, they were building a symbol of the pharaoh's power and legacy. Their work, while physically demanding, was seen as a sacred task, an essential part of the divine order that governed Egyptian society. The pharaoh was at the center of this order, and the workers, through their labor, ensured that the pharaoh's memory would last for eternity. As we continue to explore the construction of the pyramids, we are reminded of the complexity of ancient Egyptian society. The workers, while not slaves, still lived in difficult conditions. Their lives were defined by their work on the pyramids, and they played an essential role in creating one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Egypt. The pyramids' construction was not just a physical feat, but a religious and political act, a demonstration of the power and divinity of the pharaohs. Would you have been able to endure such a grueling life for a cause larger than yourself? Could you have found meaning in your labor, knowing that your work would be remembered for centuries to come, even if your name would be lost to time? The enduring legacy of the pyramids and reflections on their significance. As we reach the final section of our exploration into the construction of the Great Pyramids, we must reflect not only on the labor and dedication of the workers, but also on the profound impact these structures have had on history, culture, and the human imagination. The Great Pyramids, particularly the Pyramid of Khufu, stand as symbols of both human ingenuity and the might of the pharaohs. They have withstood millennia of natural disasters, invasions, and time itself, continuing to captivate and inspire people around the world. The purpose of the pyramids, however, was not solely to leave a legacy of architectural grandeur. They were built as tombs for the pharaohs, places where the ruler could begin his journey to the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that the physical body needed to be preserved for the soul to live on in eternity, and the pyramids were constructed as a means of ensuring that the pharaohs could successfully transition to the next world. The vast resources, labor, and time spent on these structures were all dedicated to ensuring the pharaohs' immortality. Interestingly, while we admire the pyramids today for their sheer scale and engineering brilliance, the pharaohs' motivations were rooted in religious beliefs that may seem strange to modern eyes. The pyramids were symbols of cosmic order, designed to ensure that the pharaoh could continue to rule in the afterlife, and that Egypt would remain stable under divine leadership. The exact methods of construction may remain a mystery, but what is clear is that the project was a monumental endeavor that required not just skilled laborers, but also the organization and cooperation of the entire society. As the centuries have passed, the pyramids have become symbols not only of Egypt's ancient past, but also of the enduring power of human creativity and effort. The pyramids have inspired countless architects, engineers, and artists, each seeking to understand the secrets of their construction. They have been the subject of fascination for adventurers, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike, who continue to speculate about how they were built and why. The legacy of these structures has shaped much of how we think about ancient civilizations and their ability to create enduring monuments. But beyond their physical and cultural significance, the pyramids also stand as a reminder of the profound relationship between labor, power, and legacy. The workers who labored to build the pyramids were, in many ways, the true architects of Egypt's enduring fame. They were not mere slaves, but skilled laborers who, through their tireless work, ensured that the pharaoh's memory would live on forever. The pyramids are a testament to their dedication, and though their names may have been forgotten, their work continues to stand as a monument to their contributions. Even more than that, the Great Pyramids offer us a glimpse into the values and priorities of ancient Egyptian society. The construction of such an enormous project was not just an architectural feat, it was a religious and political act, deeply embedded in the fabric of Egyptian culture. The pharaohs used the pyramids to reinforce their divine authority, while the laborers and artisans who worked on them played a crucial role in the empire's survival and expansion. Today, the pyramids stand as reminders of what can be achieved through cooperation, dedication, and a shared sense of purpose. They challenge us to think about our own legacies. What will we leave behind? The Great Pyramids have survived for over 4,000 years, and their story is still being told, inspiring awe and wonder in those who visit them and in those who study them from afar. Reflection. Looking at the pyramids today, we may marvel at their scale and beauty, but we must also remember the immense effort that went into their creation. The workers, though nameless to history, were as much a part of the pyramid's story as the pharaohs themselves. Their labor, dedication, and sacrifice created a structure that continues to shape our understanding of ancient Egypt and human achievement. In a world where the builders of monuments are often forgotten, the pyramids serve as a reminder that greatness is not just about the famous names, but also about the collective efforts of those who make it possible. As we leave behind our own legacies, whether through our work, our creations, or our contributions to society, we are reminded of the enduring power of human collaboration and the lasting impact of our actions. The pyramids stand not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon of what is possible when people come together to build something that will outlast them. The life of a medieval serf, more than just hard work. The struggles of the medieval peasant. When we think of the medieval period, we often picture knights in shining armor, grand castles, and epic battles. However, the vast majority of people living during the medieval era were not warriors or nobility. They were peasants, serfs bound to the land they worked, living lives defined by hardship, oppression, and very little opportunity for advancement. The life of a serf in medieval Europe was often one of near constant struggle. Unlike slaves, who were considered property, serfs were technically free people. However, their freedom was severely restricted. They were legally bound to a piece of land, and their lives were dictated by the demands of the lord who owned that land. A serf could not leave the land without the lord's permission, and their labor was not their own to sell. Instead, they were obligated to work the land for the lord in exchange for protection and the right to live on the land. This relationship was called manorialism, and it formed the economic backbone of feudal society. The serfs' daily life revolved around agricultural labor. They worked long hours from dawn until dusk, tending crops, planting, harvesting, and maintaining the fields. Most serfs lived in small villages and worked the land that surrounded them. Their homes were simple, usually made of mud, straw, and wood, with thatched roofs. They had little in the way of personal comfort or luxury, and their diets were limited to what they could grow themselves: bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat if they were fortunate. They often suffered from malnutrition, as food was scarce, especially during harsh winters or poor harvests. The work itself was physically demanding. Farming in the medieval period was labor-intensive, with tools that were basic by modern standards. Serfs used wooden plows and sickles to tend to the land, often working with little more than their hands to make a living. The work was never-ending, as there was always something that needed to be done. Even during the winter months, when much of the land was dormant, the serfs still had to tend to livestock, mend fences, and prepare for the next planting season. Despite the hard work, the serfs' labor was never enough to ensure a comfortable life. They were required to give a significant portion of their crops and earnings to the lord. This was known as the tithe, a tax that could be as much as 10% of their produce. In addition to the tithe, serfs were often required to provide labor to the lord without compensation. This might involve repairing roads, building structures, or performing other tasks around the manor. The lord would often provide the serfs with protection in return, but the relationship was largely one-sided. The lord held the power, and the serfs had little recourse if they were treated unfairly. Serfs were also bound to the land in a way that made it difficult for them to ever escape their circumstances. They could not sell their land or their labor without permission from the lord, and they could not marry without the lord's approval. This created a rigid social structure where mobility was almost impossible. Children born to serfs were also bound to the land, ensuring that the cycle of poverty and hard labor continued from one generation to the next. The lord, on the other hand, lived in relative comfort compared to the serfs. While the serfs worked the land, the lord often resided in a large manor or castle, where they could enjoy the fruits of the labor provided by the peasants. The lord's wealth came from the land, and it was from the serfs' labor that the wealth was generated. The feudal system created a stark divide between the nobility and the serfs, with little opportunity for social mobility. Despite these hardships, the serfs did have some agency in their lives. They formed close-knit communities and often worked together to share the burden of the harvests. The church played a central role in their lives, offering spiritual guidance and a sense of hope, even in the face of their difficult lives. Many serfs were also able to participate in local festivals and religious observances, which provided moments of respite from the grind of daily labor. Yet for all the camaraderie and moments of joy, the life of a serf was one of constant labor, social constraint, and little hope for improvement. Even the smallest misstep, whether it be poor harvests or failing to meet the demands of the lord, could result in dire consequences. The threat of punishment, whether it was additional labor or, in extreme cases, physical punishment, hung over the serfs like a shadow. The hidden strength of serfs and the role of religion. While the life of a medieval serf may appear to be one of unrelenting hardship, there were aspects of their existence that helped them endure, adapt, and sometimes even find a sense of purpose amid their struggles. One of the most important of these factors was community. The medieval serf was not isolated in their suffering, but rather part of a larger, interconnected social fabric. Within their small villages, serfs relied on each other for survival, forming tight-knit groups bound by shared experience and necessity. The feudal system, while oppressive, also created a kind of social security for the serfs. Though their freedom was severely limited, the system did provide them with protection and stability in a time when such guarantees were rare. The lord, despite being the dominant figure on the land, was obligated to offer military protection to his serfs in times of danger, and the church was often an even more significant source of solace and security. In times of famine, plague, or war, the local community would often come together to support one another. While the lord and his knights might be absent, the serfs could rely on their neighbors for help in growing crops, caring for animals, and performing other laborious tasks. This collective effort helped ensure that families could survive even the most difficult times. Moreover, the close-knit nature of these villages created an environment where people could find camaraderie, if not happiness, in their shared circumstances. The church played an even more crucial role in the life of a medieval serf. Christianity was deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval society, and the church provided both spiritual and material support to the people. Religion offered an explanation for the hardships of life. Suffering in this world was seen as part of God's divine plan, and those who endured in humility would be rewarded in the afterlife. The promise of salvation was a source of immense comfort for the serfs, and many found strength in the idea that their suffering was not in vain. For the peasants, religious observances were often the only real breaks in the relentless routine of labor. The church was a place of refuge, a sanctuary not only from the physical work of the fields but also from the social constraints of feudal life. In the church, all people were equal in the eyes of God, regardless of their social standing. The church provided both solace and a sense of hope, with its teachings of charity, forgiveness, and divine justice, offering a way to make sense of a life that seemed, at times, overwhelmingly unfair. The Christian calendar also provided structure to the lives of the serfs. Religious holidays and feast days offered opportunities to rest, even if only briefly, and to gather with family and friends. These days became moments of respite from the daily grind. Though the holidays were still rooted in religious observances, they were also times for celebrations, feasts, and socializing, giving the serfs a chance to experience joy and community. In addition to religious solace, serfs had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the land. Many serfs were skilled in agricultural practices, having inherited knowledge passed down through generations. They understood the seasons, the crops, and the weather patterns better than anyone else in society. This knowledge gave them a certain power, one that they could rely on to survive, even if they could not break free from the constraints of their social position. The agricultural knowledge of serfs played a pivotal role in feeding the kingdom. Without the hard labor of the peasants, the entire feudal system would have collapsed. Ironically, while the serfs' lives were bound to the land and limited in their opportunities, their work was indispensable to the survival of the entire social order. Their labor, though often invisible and unappreciated, was the foundation of the medieval economy. For despite the reliance on their labor, the serfs had no political power. They were denied the right to vote, to challenge their lords, or to demand better conditions. They were the workers without recognition, their contributions often overlooked by the ruling class. But their quiet strength, seen in their resilience, their bonds with each other, and their deep spiritual faith, was the true force that held the system together. Without it, the medieval world would have collapsed long before the onset of the Renaissance. Yet, despite their critical role in the survival of the system, many serfs would never see any form of reward for their labor beyond the bare minimum required for survival. Social mobility was virtually impossible. The cycle of poverty and servitude continued from one generation to the next. Sons followed in their father's footsteps, inheriting the same burdens, and daughters married into the same oppressive system. But the serfs' persistence and endurance played a role in the long-term stability of the feudal system. Their work allowed for the creation of monumental cathedrals, the development of trade routes, and the expansion of kingdoms. The labor of the serfs may not have been glamorous, but it laid the foundation for much of what would come in the centuries to follow. The lasting impact of serfs and the legacy of feudal life. As we near the end of our exploration into the lives of medieval serfs, it is important to reflect on their lasting impact, not just on the medieval world, but on the course of history itself. While the serfs may have been relegated to the lower rungs of society, their labor and contributions were crucial to the functioning of the feudal system, and in many ways, their legacy has shaped the modern world in ways we often overlook. The serfs, through their hard work, ensured the stability and survival of the kingdoms in which they lived. They grew the crops, raised the animals, and carried out the essential tasks that made life possible. The economy of medieval Europe depended on their labor, and without them, the feudal system would have collapsed. Though the serfs received little in return for their work, their role in society was indispensable. In fact, many of the developments that we associate with the medieval period, such as the construction of castles, cathedrals, and roads, were made possible by the labor of serfs. Their work helped build the very infrastructure that allowed for the expansion of empires, the spread of Christianity, and the eventual rise of towns and cities. Without the peasants to provide the food, the political and religious elite would not have had the luxury to focus on matters of governance, philosophy, or the arts. But it is not just the physical contributions of the serfs that shaped history. It is also their role in the cultural and social dynamics of the time. The bonds that formed between peasants, whether through shared religious practices or communal labor, laid the foundation for the development of collective identity and solidarity. Even in the face of overwhelming hardship, serfs found ways to come together to resist their circumstances, though often in subtle and invisible ways. While direct revolts and uprisings were rare in medieval Europe, the serfs did manage to carve out small moments of resistance. From the village festivals to the secretive gatherings of workers, these quiet acts of rebellion allowed serfs to assert their humanity in a society that sought to suppress them. Even when their voices went unheard by the ruling class, the serfs found ways to preserve their culture, their faith, and their dignity. In the grand scheme of history, the legacy of the medieval serf is one that is often overlooked. The elites, the kings, queens, and knights, are the ones who have left their mark on history books, their names etched into the annals of time. But it is the serfs who enabled the grandeur of the medieval world to exist. They were the foundation upon which the castles and cathedrals were built, the labor force that powered the feudal system. The impact of their labor did not end with the collapse of the feudal system in the 15th century. In many ways, the medieval serfs' experience laid the groundwork for the modern working class. The rise of the merchant class, the growth of cities, and the advent of the Industrial Revolution can all trace their roots back to the struggles and contributions of the serfs. The idea of labor as a central aspect of societal organization evolved from the medieval feudal system, where labor was both essential and exploited. Moreover, the collective identity formed by the serfs eventually contributed to the broader movements for social change. While they may not have had the power to challenge the system in their own time, their sacrifices, their endurance, and their resilience laid the foundation for future uprisings, revolutions, and social reforms. The serfs' contributions were instrumental in the shaping of the societies that followed, as the notion of the rights of the working class slowly began to take root. In reflecting on the legacy of the serfs, we must also recognize the larger theme of social inequality and the human drive for self-determination. The medieval peasant's struggle, though largely invisible to history, serves as a powerful reminder that those who are often left out of the history books are the ones who keep societies functioning. Their labor, their sacrifices, and their resilience paved the way for the freedoms and rights that many enjoy today. Even though they lived under the constant weight of feudal obligation, the serfs' work was essential in shaping the course of history. In the centuries that followed, their efforts laid the foundation for social change, the rise of the middle class, and the eventual overthrow of systems that sought to oppress the masses. Reflection. When we think of history, we often look to the powerful figures who shaped the world, but we must also remember the unsung heroes, the workers, the peasants, the everyday people whose lives and labor made it all possible. The legacy of the medieval serf is a reminder that history is not just about kings and generals, but also about those whose work is often unseen. The struggles of the serfs laid the foundation for many of the freedoms we take for granted today, and their resilience in the face of oppression continues to inspire movements for justice and equality. As we move forward, we can learn from the quiet strength of the medieval serfs. Despite their hardships, they built the world in which we live, and their legacy should not be forgotten. Their contributions remind us that every person, no matter their station, has the power to shape the course of history. How the Vikings actually lived. Spoiler, not just raiding. The Viking identity beyond the raid. When we think of the Vikings, the first images that likely come to mind are longships cutting through the seas, fierce warriors with axes and helmets, raiding coastal villages, and plundering treasures. Hollywood and popular media have painted a picture of Vikings as relentless invaders, but this image only tells part of the story. While raiding was indeed a significant aspect of Viking culture, it was far from the only aspect. The true life of the Vikings is far more complex and fascinating than just their fearsome reputation as raiders. The Vikings originated from the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, during the late 8th to early 11th centuries, a period known as the Viking Age. But despite the popular association with seafaring violence, the Vikings were also skilled traders, farmers, craftsmen, and settlers. Their society was deeply structured, and their contributions to trade, exploration, and culture had lasting impacts on the world. The Viking raids were not unprovoked attacks or mindless acts of violence. They were often strategic and economically motivated. The Vikings targeted coastal towns and monasteries because these were areas rich in resources, particularly treasure, which was often used to fuel further exploration and settlement. For the Vikings, the act of raiding was often a way to acquire wealth and expand their influence, rather than an endless spree of destruction. Beyond the battle axe, Vikings were skilled navigators and explorers. They mastered the use of the longship, a versatile vessel designed for both speed and maneuverability. These ships allowed them to explore vast distances, from North America to the Middle East. The Vikings' longships were advanced for their time, designed for swift travel across both open seas and shallow rivers. This technological innovation made the Viking Age possible and enabled their culture to spread across Europe, Asia, and even into the North American continent. But Viking society wasn't just about exploration and raiding. It was a complex and vibrant culture with distinct social structures, religious beliefs, and a rich tradition of art and craftsmanship. Life for most Vikings was centered around farming, trading, and family life. The average Viking, whether in Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, lived in small farming communities. Their homes were typically longhouses made from wood, stone, and turf, with a central hearth for warmth and cooking. These homes were often shared by extended families, and the sense of community was vital for survival in the harsh northern climate. Vikings were skilled farmers, growing crops like barley, oats, and rye, as well as raising livestock such as cattle, pigs, and sheep. The land was harsh and often infertile, But the Vikings developed innovative farming techniques to make the most of what they had. They used crop rotation and animal manure to improve soil quality, and they built large communal farms where multiple families could work together to harvest food for the coming winter. Trade, too, was an essential part of Viking life. Far from the pillaging, Viking merchants established extensive trade networks that reached as far as the Byzantine Empire, the Middle East, and even North America. The Vikings traded everything from furs and iron to amber and honey, establishing their presence in bustling trade hubs like Dublin, York, and Kiev. This trade helped sustain their economy and enabled them to continue their seafaring ventures. But perhaps one of the most surprising aspects of Viking life is the role of women in their society. While Viking women did not have the same rights as men, they enjoyed far more freedom and autonomy than women in many other contemporary cultures. Viking women were responsible for managing households, including overseeing the farms, tending to livestock, and ensuring the well-being of the family. In the absence of their husbands, who might be away raiding or trading, Viking women took on a leading role in the family and community. Women in Viking society were also integral to the production of goods. They spun wool into cloth, created clothing, and were skilled in various crafts. Viking women were also known to have participated in political and social affairs, though their roles were often overshadowed by the male-dominated warriors. Some Viking women even took part in battles, with a few becoming legendary shield maidens, a title that reflected their warrior status. The Vikings were also deeply religious, and their belief system was a crucial part of their identity. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, including Odin, Thor, and Freyja, and believed in an afterlife where warriors who died in battle were rewarded by being taken to Valhalla, a great hall in the sky. While Norse mythology and Viking religious practices have been romanticized in modern culture, they were central to Viking society and helped shape their worldviews. Viking social structure and cultural legacy. The social structure of Viking society was distinct, organized, and highly hierarchical, yet it also allowed for some flexibility, particularly for those with enough wealth, skill, or influence. At the top of the social ladder were the kings and nobles, the rulers and powerful landowners who held the most authority. Beneath them were the jarls, who were high-ranking nobles or chieftains in Viking communities. These individuals played a central role in organizing raids, overseeing local administration, and making decisions on matters of law and warfare. However, the majority of Viking society consisted of the carls, the free farmers, artisans, and merchants who were considered the backbone of the Viking economy. While they were not as wealthy or powerful as the elite, the carls had the freedom to own land, form businesses, and participate in raids or trading expeditions. Their position in society allowed for a certain degree of autonomy, though they still had obligations to their lords and rulers. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, slaves captured in battle, born into servitude, or those who had fallen into slavery due to debt or punishment. Thralls were considered property and had no rights, often working in the households of the wealthy or on farms. While thralls held the lowest status, some did manage to gain freedom and rise within Viking society, especially if they were able to prove their worth through hard work or bravery in battle. Viking society, while structured, was far from rigid. There was significant mobility for those with the right skills or connections. For example, many warriors were able to gain wealth and status through successful raids, becoming wealthy merchants or landowners. A Viking who started life as a humble farmer could, through skill and perseverance, rise to become a powerful jarl or even a king. This possibility for social advancement was one of the features that made Viking society unique compared to other contemporary societies, where the aristocracy was often more strictly defined by birth. While the Vikings are most often remembered for their violent conquests and raids, it is important to understand that their culture also valued craftsmanship, artistry, and the building of strong communities. Craftsmanship was highly esteemed in Viking society, and it was through this craft that many Vikings were able to express their cultural identity. The Vikings were skilled metal workers, woodworkers, and shipbuilders, and their creations, such as intricately designed swords, jewelry, and ships, are still celebrated for their beauty and durability. The Viking longship, in particular, is an emblem of their ingenuity and cultural prowess. These ships were not only practical tools for raiding and exploration, but they were also a reflection of Viking craftsmanship. The construction of a longship was a significant communal effort, requiring skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, and designers to work together. The ships were designed for both speed and durability, capable of withstanding the harsh conditions of the North Sea and traversing shallow waters along rivers. This level of craftsmanship allowed the Vikings to conduct raids, establish settlements, and even explore the coasts of North America long before Christopher Columbus set sail. While Vikings are often portrayed as uncivilized barbarians, the reality of their culture reveals a sophisticated and highly organized society. Their trading network spanned much of Europe, from the British Isles to Constantinople, and they were instrumental in connecting the East and West. The Vikings brought not only goods such as furs, iron, and amber, but also knowledge, sharing technological innovations, architectural techniques, and cultural practices with the regions they interacted with. The Vikings were also remarkable for their explorations and settlements. While the stories of Viking raids are well known, it is equally important to recognize their role as pioneers and settlers. One of the most impressive feats of Viking exploration was their establishment of a settlement in Vinland, present-day Newfoundland in Canada, around the year 1000. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is credited with this remarkable achievement, marking the first known European landing in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus's voyages. But the Vikings did not only focus on exploration and warfare. They were also farmers and settlers who established long-lasting colonies. The Viking settlements in Normandy, modern France, and Iceland are perhaps the most well-known examples. In these regions, the Vikings not only established a stronghold but also cultivated the land, developed local economies, and introduced Scandinavian culture to new parts of Europe. In Iceland, the Vikings created a unique form of self-governance, the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, where free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes. The decline of the Vikings and their lasting influence. By the end of the 11th century, the Viking Age began to fade, and the world that had been shaped by their raids, settlements, and explorations underwent significant changes. While the Viking raids may have gradually diminished, the cultural, social, and political legacies of the Vikings continued to resonate throughout Europe and beyond. The decline of the Viking Age was driven by several factors, from the consolidation of Christian kingdoms in Europe to the internal shifts in Viking society itself. One of the most important factors in the decline of the Vikings was the spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia. In the early days of Viking expansion, Norse paganism was central to their identity, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja guiding their beliefs and practices. Viking kings and chieftains, however, began to embrace Christianity over time, often due to political alliances with Christian monarchs and the influence of the Catholic Church. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it transformed Viking culture, leading to a gradual decline in the raiding lifestyle. Christianization brought about changes in social norms, the abolition of slavery, and the promotion of a more settled, agrarian way of life. The Viking raids had also become increasingly difficult due to the consolidation of power in Europe. Stronger kingdoms, such as France and England, were able to defend themselves more effectively against Viking invaders. With the establishment of fortified towns, castles, and improved military tactics, Viking raids became less effective and less frequent. At the same time, internal conflicts within Viking society, such as power struggles between Viking rulers, further weakened their ability to sustain large-scale invasions and conquests. The Viking settlements in Normandy and England also evolved. The Norsemen who settled in these regions gradually assimilated into local cultures, marrying local women, adopting Christianity, and integrating with the existing political structures. In Normandy, the Viking descendants, known as the Normans, became some of the most powerful and influential rulers of medieval Europe. One of the most famous of these was William the Conqueror, who, in 1066, successfully invaded England, forever altering the course of English history. The influence of the Vikings can be seen in the Norman rule of England, as well as in the establishment of a powerful Norman presence in southern Italy and Sicily. In Iceland, the Vikings established a unique form of self-governance, as previously mentioned, the Althing, which became the foundation of Icelandic democracy. The Vikings in Iceland managed to create a society that was both egalitarian and independent, relying on laws and councils rather than centralized kingship. Though Iceland remained a relatively isolated island for much of its history, its Viking heritage and democratic traditions had a profound influence on later political thought, particularly in the development of Western concepts of governance and law. While the raiding and warfare of the Viking Age had ended, their influence on the European landscape was undeniable. The Vikings had not only shaped the territories they invaded, but their interactions with the people they encountered left lasting imprints on culture, language, and trade. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, had a lasting impact on the development of the English language, with many words and phrases that we use today originating from Old Norse. In places like the British Isles, the Viking influence is still evident in place names, surnames, and vocabulary. Moreover, the Viking expansion led to the creation of new trade routes that connected Europe to the Middle East, Asia, and even North America. These trade networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies, contributing to the broader flow of knowledge and commerce between cultures. The Viking emphasis on exploration and travel also opened up new regions for trade and settlement, ensuring their legacy as one of the greatest seafaring cultures in history. The Viking legacy can be seen in modern times as well. The Vikings are often portrayed in popular culture as fierce warriors and explorers, but their cultural and social contributions were just as significant. Their ability to adapt to different environments, their craftsmanship, and their innovations in navigation and shipbuilding laid the groundwork for the modern world. The Vikings' journey from raiders to settlers, traders, and explorers demonstrates the complexity of their society and the lasting influence they had on shaping the medieval and early modern world. The story of the Vikings is not one of a single, violent age of conquest, but rather of a dynamic and evolving culture that contributed to the shaping of Europe and beyond. Though the Viking Age may have ended, their legacy is far from forgotten. Their legacy lives on in the language, traditions, and culture of the countries they touched, as well as in the stories that continue to captivate audiences to this day. Reflection. The Vikings' story is not just one of pillaging and conquest, but also one of resilience, adaptation, and cultural exchange. In a world where warriors and conquerors often dominate the historical narrative, the Vikings remind us of the importance of understanding the complexities of societies, of how even those seen as outsiders can leave an indelible mark on history. Their transformation from raiders to settlers, their contributions to trade and governance, and their legacy of exploration show that even in the midst of violence, there can be growth, change, and the foundation of something enduring. The Vikings are more than just warriors. They are a testament to the power of adaptability and perseverance in the face of a rapidly changing world. Their story continues to inspire and shape our understanding of both history and the human spirit. The untold stories of ancient Egyptian farmers. The life of an ancient Egyptian farmer. When we think of ancient Egypt, Our minds are often drawn to the majestic pyramids, the powerful pharaohs, and the awe-inspiring temples. However, the true backbone of ancient Egyptian society was not the elite ruling class, but the farmers who worked the land. These individuals, whose names have long been forgotten by history, played an essential role in ensuring the survival of one of the world's oldest and most influential civilizations. The Egyptian civilization was born along the banks of the Nile River, a fertile strip of land that provided the necessary resources to sustain life. The Nile's annual flooding deposited rich silt onto the soil, making the land incredibly fertile. This made agriculture the foundation of Egyptian society. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers, and their labor was vital to the empire's economic and social structure. Egyptian farmers worked long, grueling hours to cultivate the land and ensure that the food supply was sufficient to feed the population. The land was divided into large estates owned by the pharaoh or local nobility, and the farmers worked the land on behalf of these landowners. Most farmers lived in small villages near the fields, and their homes were simple mud brick structures, often shared by extended families. The life of an Egyptian farmer was centered around the agricultural cycle. The annual flooding of the Nile marked the beginning of the farming season, and this was a time of great anticipation. The floodwaters would recede, leaving behind a rich layer of silt, which the farmers would plow and plant with crops. The primary crops grown in Egypt were wheat, barley, flax, and various vegetables. These crops formed the core of the Egyptian diet, providing sustenance for the population. Despite the fertile land, farming was not an easy task. The weather could be unpredictable, and the farmers had to carefully manage the water supply to ensure that their crops received the right amount of irrigation. The Nile's floods were crucial to agriculture, but if the flooding was too high or too low, it could devastate the crops. A poor harvest could lead to famine, and many farmers lived in constant fear of the potential consequences of such a disaster. Farmers did not work the land alone. They were often assisted by slaves or other laborers, and the work was done collectively. Large irrigation projects were constructed to help control the flow of water from the Nile, and farmers worked together to maintain these systems. Despite the hardships, the collective nature of farming allowed Egyptian farmers to endure and thrive, at least in good years. The role of religion, taxes, and the social hierarchy. For the ancient Egyptian farmers, life was not just defined by the physical challenges of working the land. Their existence was also shaped by the larger social, political, and religious framework that dominated Egyptian society. This framework provided structure, meaning, and sometimes hardship, but it also helped unite the farmers with the larger vision of Egyptian civilization. Religion and the cycle of the Nile. Religion played a central role in the lives of Egyptian farmers. The Nile, which provided the fertile soil needed for agriculture, was also seen as a divine gift, and its flooding was believed to be the tears of the goddess Isis, mourning her dead husband Osiris. The Egyptians saw the rhythm of the Nile's flooding as tied directly to the god's favor. The annual cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting was embedded with religious significance. In many ways, farming was seen as a sacred duty, a service to the gods and the pharaoh, who was viewed as the living god on earth. The farmers often participated in rituals to honor the gods of fertility and the harvest. Offerings of food, incense, and livestock were made in hopes of securing a good harvest. Farmers would also pray for favorable weather, asking for just the right amount of rain and sunshine. The belief that their work was part of a divine plan helped Egyptian farmers persevere through the difficulties of their labor, as it gave them a sense of purpose and connection to the cosmic order. Taxes and obligations to the pharaoh. While farming was essential to the survival of Egypt, it was also a source of revenue for the ruling elite. The pharaoh and his officials imposed taxes on the agricultural production of the land, and these taxes were often taken in the form of crops. Farmers were required to give a portion of their harvest to the state, which would then be used to feed the army, maintain the pharaoh's royal court, and fund the construction of monumental projects such as temples and pyramids. Taxes could vary depending on the region, but the overall burden was significant. A common tax was the tithe, which required farmers to give 10% of their produce to the state. This was a heavy tax for the average farmer, and it often left them with just enough food to sustain their families. To make matters more difficult, farmers could also be subject to additional taxes imposed during times of famine or war. Yet despite these taxing demands, the farmers had little choice but to comply. The social hierarchy of ancient Egypt was rigid, and the pharaoh, as the divine ruler, had absolute control over the land. The farmers' lives were bound to the land they worked, and their obedience to the pharaoh's rule was considered essential for maintaining order and balance within society. Social hierarchy and the farmer's role. Farmers were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below the priests, scribes, and nobles, but above the slaves. While they were not considered property like slaves, they had limited personal freedom. Their labor was heavily controlled, not just by the landowners but also by the officials who oversaw the collection of taxes and the management of agricultural resources. Despite their crucial role in sustaining Egyptian society, farmers were often seen as lower-class citizens, and their labor was undervalued by those in positions of power. Though they were free in a legal sense, many farmers were bound to their land and could not leave without the permission of the landowner or the pharaoh. This limited mobility and their lack of political power meant that farmers had little recourse when they were overburdened by taxes or treated unfairly. However, the connection between farming and religion did offer some solace, as many farmers believed that their hard work was part of the greater divine plan, ensuring the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the nation. Despite these challenges, farmers did enjoy some privileges. Those who were able to farm land that produced large harvests could accumulate wealth, and some farmers could even afford to send their children to be trained as scribes or artisans. This offered a small chance for social mobility, but it was rare. The majority of farmers lived simple lives, working the land day in and day out, with little hope of ever changing their status. The legacy of ancient Egyptian farmers and their impact on society. Though the lives of the ancient Egyptian farmers were largely defined by hardship and the struggle for survival, their labor left an indelible mark on Egyptian civilization. It is no exaggeration to say that without the work of these farmers, the grand monuments, the pharaohs, and the complex society that we associate with ancient Egypt would not have been possible. Agricultural innovations and their lasting influence. The ancient Egyptians were pioneers in agricultural innovation, and the techniques they developed would have lasting effects on agriculture throughout history. The importance of the Nile's annual flooding shaped their understanding of irrigation and crop management. The Egyptians were among the first to develop systems of canals and basins to channel the floodwaters from the Nile to the fields, ensuring a consistent water supply for crops. This early form of irrigation allowed them to grow food in an otherwise dry and barren landscape. The shaduf, a hand-operated device used to lift water from the Nile to irrigate crops, is one of the most well-known inventions that emerged from this period. Farmers also developed plows and other tools to make their work more efficient. These innovations were instrumental in creating a stable food supply, which in turn allowed Egypt to flourish as a powerful civilization. Beyond irrigation, Egyptian farmers also contributed to the development of farming techniques that are still used today. For example, the Egyptians practiced crop rotation, a technique that allowed the soil to recover and remain fertile year after year. This helped prevent soil depletion and ensured that agricultural production could continue for generations. Their farming methods were also deeply connected to their spiritual and cultural practices. The act of planting and harvesting crops was imbued with religious meaning, and many festivals celebrated the agricultural cycle, such as the Inundation Festival, which marked the rise of the Nile's floodwaters. These celebrations helped reinforce the connection between agriculture, religion, and the broader well-being of the society. The enduring legacy of the Nile and Egyptian agriculture. Even today, the Nile remains central to Egypt's agricultural production. The ancient Egyptian farmers' understanding of the river's seasonal cycles and their development of irrigation systems has endured for thousands of years. Modern-day farmers still rely on the river's water for their crops, and Egypt continues to depend on agriculture as one of its main economic activities. Additionally, the food produced by Egyptian farmers played a central role in the success of Egyptian trade networks. The Egyptians not only grew enough food to sustain their population, but also produced surplus crops that were traded with neighboring regions. Grains like wheat and barley were exchanged for luxury goods such as gold, incense, and cedarwood, which were transported through Egypt's extensive trade routes. The trade in agricultural goods helped Egypt become a key player in the ancient Mediterranean economy and fostered relationships with other powerful civilizations, including those in the Near East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The farmers' unacknowledged contribution to Egyptian civilization. Despite their vital role in sustaining the economy and culture, ancient Egyptian farmers were largely forgotten by history. The grandeur of the pyramids, temples, and the power of the pharaohs often overshadowed the hard work of the common people who made these feats possible. While the elite lived in palaces and the pharaohs were revered as gods, it was the farmers who worked the land and provided the food that allowed the entire system to function. In the grand narrative of Egypt's history, the contributions of the farmers were often marginalized, but without their labor, none of the impressive accomplishments of ancient Egypt would have been possible. The tombs of the pharaohs and the monuments to the gods stand as a testament to their wealth and power, but these structures were only built because there was a labor force that could make them a reality. What is perhaps most striking about the legacy of the ancient Egyptian farmers is the way their work helped to create an enduring civilization. While many of the pharaohs and rulers were eventually forgotten, the contributions of these farmers have lasted. Their agricultural innovations, religious practices, and labor practices shaped not just the history of Egypt, but the entire development of human society. Reflection. The story of the ancient Egyptian farmers is a reminder that history is often told through the lens of the powerful, but it is the labor of the ordinary people that truly shapes the course of civilization. While the pharaohs are remembered for their great monuments, it was the farmers, toiling away in the fields, who provided the foundation for those achievements. Their work is often invisible, but it is no less important than the grand accomplishments of the elites. As we reflect on their legacy, we are reminded of the deep connection between agriculture, society, and culture. The ancient Egyptians understood that their survival and success depended on the land they worked and the gods who blessed it. Their innovations in agriculture, their understanding of the Nile, and their communal efforts laid the foundation for one of the greatest civilizations in history. The silent workers of the Roman Empire, roads, aqueducts, and more. The unsung builders of the Roman world. When we think of the Roman Empire, we often picture magnificent buildings like the Colosseum, grand forums, and towering aqueducts. These structures, symbols of Roman ingenuity and power, continue to amaze us today. However, the grand achievements of the Roman Empire were not the work of emperors, senators, or generals alone. Beneath the surface, a vast network of silent workers, unseen laborers, craftsmen, and engineers, brought these monumental projects to life. They were the builders of Rome's infrastructure, the ones who worked tirelessly to lay the foundations for the empire's expansion and success. The Roman Empire was known for its remarkable feats of engineering, and much of this engineering genius relied on the skill and labor of workers whose names have been lost to history. These workers were responsible for constructing the roads, aqueducts, bridges, and public buildings that formed the backbone of Roman society. Without these laborers, the empire would not have been able to function as efficiently or as effectively as it did. Roads and infrastructure, the lifeblood of the empire. One of the most significant contributions of the Roman Empire to the modern world was its extensive network of roads. Roman roads were the arteries through which the empire's armies, traders, and citizens could move quickly and efficiently. These roads enabled communication, trade, and military movement across vast distances, linking cities and provinces from the British Isles to the Middle East. The construction of Roman roads was a complex and labor-intensive process. First, workers would clear the land, removing trees, rocks, and other obstacles. Then they would lay down a foundation of large stones, followed by a layer of smaller stones, sand, and gravel. The final surface was often made of tightly fitted paving stones, which created a durable and smooth path for travelers. Roads were built to be straight, ensuring that they would be the most efficient routes possible, and were often lined with miles markers, inns, and rest stations to accommodate those traveling long distances. Building such infrastructure required skilled labor, masons, engineers, and laborers who could execute the plans with precision. These workers were responsible for the massive task of laying out and constructing hundreds of miles of road, often working under harsh conditions. The tools they used were rudimentary by modern standards, yet they were able to create a network that allowed Rome to control and govern its vast empire. While the work itself was physically demanding, the Roman roads were integral to the empire's success. They allowed the Roman military to move rapidly across its territories, quelling rebellions and defending borders. Roads also facilitated trade, enabling merchants to transport goods between provinces, and they helped the Roman government maintain control over distant regions by making communication and transportation more efficient. Aqueducts, the flow of Roman civilization. Another remarkable achievement of the Roman Empire was its system of aqueducts, ingenious structures that transported fresh water from distant sources into Roman cities. The Roman aqueducts were crucial to the development of Roman urban life, providing water for drinking, bathing, irrigation, and even public fountains. The construction of aqueducts was a monumental task that required knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and hydraulic systems. Roman engineers used a combination of gravity, arches, and siphons to carry water over long distances, sometimes spanning vast valleys or crossing uneven terrain. The aqueducts would bring water into cities, where it was stored in large reservoirs and distributed throughout the population. The labor behind these projects was staggering. Aqueducts were built by teams of workers, often slaves or low-paid laborers who had to dig trenches, build stone structures, and ensure that the flow of water was consistent. These workers faced many challenges, working in difficult conditions, sometimes underground, and dealing with the sheer scale of the aqueducts. The construction process could take years, even decades, to complete, and yet these workers often received little recognition for their efforts. Despite the hardships, the workers who built the aqueducts were instrumental in making Roman cities the bustling metropolises that they became. Access to clean water helped Roman cities thrive, supporting the population and enabling the development of public baths, fountains, and latrines. Without these workers' contributions, the daily life of Roman citizens would have been drastically different. The role of Roman laborers in public works and the empire's military power. While the roads and aqueducts are some of the most enduring symbols of Roman engineering, they are just a part of the vast array of public works projects that define the Roman Empire. Behind the construction of monumental structures, such as temples, theaters, and bridges, was a large workforce of laborers, many of whom worked on projects under the direction of master builders and architects. Their contributions were indispensable to the success and stability of the empire, although their names have been largely erased by time. Building the Roman Forum and public buildings. The Roman Forum is perhaps the most iconic public space in Rome, serving as the center of political, religious, and social life. The buildings that surrounded the Forum, such as the Senate House, Curia, Temple of Saturn, and the Basilica Julia, were architectural marvels of the time. The construction of these massive buildings required thousands of laborers, from stone masons to carpenters, who worked with rudimentary tools but remarkable precision to build such structures. These public works were not just functional, but also meant to display the power and grandeur of the empire. The emperor and high-ranking officials used these structures to assert their authority, with the most impressive buildings being constructed to immortalize their reigns. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, for instance, was not just a religious site, but a political statement about Rome's dominance and the emperor's divine favor. The laborers who worked on these projects were not just involved in the construction of the buildings themselves, but also in the creation of the artistic elements, sculptures, mosaics, and frescoes that adorned these grand spaces. These artists and craftsmen worked meticulously to create the aesthetic that the Romans desired, one that symbolized their wealth, military power, and superiority over others. The construction of such buildings was often funded by taxes collected from the empire's provinces. The laborers, many of whom were slaves, were put to work on these large-scale public works projects. For the most part, these workers were treated as property, with little regard for their welfare or safety. The scale and labor intensity of the projects meant that injuries and even fatalities were not uncommon. The military's role in infrastructure projects. Another lesser-known aspect of Roman labor came from the Roman military, which was not just a force for conquest but also for construction. Roman soldiers were highly trained, but their duties extended far beyond combat. The Roman military played a significant role in the building of infrastructure, and soldiers were often used as engineers, architects, and laborers. One of the military's key contributions to infrastructure was the construction of forts and defensive walls along the borders of the empire. These forts were designed to house soldiers and provide protection for Roman territories. Soldiers used their engineering skills to design and construct fortified structures, many of which still stand today. The Hadrian's Wall, which marked the northern boundary of the Roman Empire in Britain, is an excellent example of military labor. Built under the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century CE, it stretched over 70 miles and required the labor of thousands of soldiers. The wall was not just a defensive barrier, but also a demonstration of the empire's power, serving as a symbol of Roman authority in the remote northern territories. Building roads for conquest and control. In addition to military forts, Roman soldiers were also responsible for constructing roads that allowed the Roman legions to move quickly throughout the empire. The roads were the lifeblood of the empire, enabling the Roman army to travel efficiently from one region to another. Roman soldiers, trained in both combat and engineering, would often dig trenches, lay down foundations, and build bridges across rivers to ensure that the roads were durable and effective. The use of soldiers for road construction helped maintain discipline, kept the army in a state of readiness, and ensured that military needs were prioritized. These roads were essential for the rapid movement of troops, which was key to the empire's success in maintaining control over vast territories. Without this extensive infrastructure, the Roman military would have been unable to respond to threats as quickly as they did. The lasting legacy of Roman labor and its influence on modern infrastructure. As we reflect on the labor that went into the construction of Rome's vast network of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, it becomes clear that the contributions of these silent workers were not just vital to the Roman Empire's success. They set the foundations for the development of infrastructure that would shape the modern world. The achievements of Roman laborers, craftsmen, and engineers continue to resonate today in the cities, roads, and public works projects that define much of modern society. The enduring Roman roads. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of Roman infrastructure is the Roman road network, which stretched across the empire, linking cities, provinces, and military outposts. The roads were essential for military movement, trade, and communication, but they also had a profound impact on the future development of Western infrastructure. Many of the modern highways in Europe and the Middle East trace their roots along ancient Roman roads. The Roman road-building techniques were unmatched in the ancient world, and their standards of construction became the foundation for the roads built in the centuries that followed. Roman roads were made with multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose: a base of large stones, a layer of gravel for drainage, and a final surface of tightly fitted paving stones. This construction method created roads that were durable and capable of withstanding the rigors of time and use. Modern engineers and architects still look to Roman roads for inspiration. The principles of road construction that the Romans established, such as drainage systems, proper grading, and the use of durable materials, are still in use today. In many ways, the Roman approach to road building laid the groundwork for the development of modern transportation networks that connect the world today. Aqueducts and water systems, the Roman legacy of engineering. The Roman aqueducts were another engineering marvel that continues to influence modern infrastructure. These aqueducts, which carried water from distant sources into Roman cities, were crucial to the health and well-being of urban populations. The advanced techniques used to build and maintain these aqueducts provided clean drinking water, allowed for public baths, and supported agriculture in arid regions. Today, water systems and aqueducts in cities around the world owe much of their design to Roman principles. The Romans were pioneers in hydraulic engineering, creating complex systems of tunnels, bridges, and channels to transport water over long distances. Many of these systems were designed with gravity in mind, using the natural slope of the land to maintain the flow of water. Modern water systems, particularly in cities that have grown along ancient Roman trade routes, still follow these Roman principles. The use of arches and vaults in water distribution structures has inspired the design of contemporary aqueducts and pipelines. In fact, some of the original Roman aqueducts are still functional today, proving the durability and longevity of Roman engineering. Roman influence on modern architecture. In addition to their engineering feats, the Romans also had a profound influence on architecture. The Roman arch, the dome, and the vault were innovations that allowed the Romans to build structures on an unprecedented scale. These architectural techniques enabled the creation of iconic structures such as the Pantheon, the Colosseum, and the Roman baths, structures that have influenced architectural design throughout history. The use of arches and domes allowed for the creation of large, open interior spaces without the need for supporting columns. This technique paved the way for the construction of massive public buildings, bridges, and even modern skyscrapers. Today, we see the legacy of Roman architecture in many modern buildings, including government buildings, cathedrals, and even sports stadiums. The Roman commitment to public works, from roads and aqueducts to public baths and theaters, also laid the groundwork for the concept of public infrastructure as we understand it today. Roman cities were designed to serve the needs of their inhabitants, with a focus on providing access to water, sanitation, and public spaces. This commitment to public service is reflected in the modern concept of municipal infrastructure, where governments are responsible for ensuring that their citizens have access to essential services and amenities. Reflection. The silent workers who built the infrastructure of the Roman Empire may not have been celebrated in their time, but their labor has left a profound impact on the world. The roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that they constructed laid the foundations for modern infrastructure, shaping the way we live, travel, and interact with our environment today. The legacy of Roman labor is a reminder that the physical and social infrastructure of any civilization is built on the sweat and sacrifice of countless individuals, whose contributions are often unseen, but no less essential. As we reflect on the lasting influence of the Roman Empire, we are reminded of the importance of infrastructure in shaping the world. The roads we travel on, the water we drink, and the buildings we inhabit all owe something to the labor of those who came before us. And though the names of these workers may never be known, their legacy lives on in the very structures that continue to support our civilization.